It's Mark's account of the resurrection. Mark writes for us, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?' And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you.' And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
We're blessed indeed to have Jeff Aernie from UTC ministering to us this morning as he opens up that passage of Mark's Gospel. So I'd like to invite Jeff to come forward and share with us this morning. Thank you, Jeff.
I should start out by apologizing. I know I went a little bit longer than I was supposed to yesterday. I didn't follow the beatitude of public speaking, which is, "Blessed is he who finishes early, for he shall be asked to return."
And there was Lloyd.
I hope that you won't think that I'm strange or odd for talking about the way in which we speak as disciples by reading a text in Mark's Gospel that seemingly ends with no one speaking. Yesterday, as we looked at the narrative of the Syrophoenician woman, one of the points that we stressed was that when Mark begins to develop what he talks about or what he thinks about Christian discipleship, one of the primary components is speaking. Speaking Jesus' logos, speaking Jesus' message, speaking Jesus' words after him. So if one of the key components of Christian discipleship is speaking, then how is it possible that Mark's Gospel ends like this? We need a very brief side note here, don't we? I'm going to assume that Mark 16:8 is the intentional conclusion to Mark's Gospel. I'm sure that in your Bibles there are more verses beyond 16:8. Perhaps they're in brackets or in italics, or perhaps there's a footnote there that has some more information. I'm not going to work through those questions with you this morning. We just don't have time. I'll be around a little bit longer today, so if you want to catch me and we can talk more about that, or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to provide more resources on that question. But for our purposes, Mark 16:8 is the intentional conclusion of Mark's Gospel. So as we look at Mark 16:8, we have to ask the question, if one of the key components of Christian discipleship is speaking, then how is it possible that Mark's Gospel ends like this? To answer that question, we have to think carefully about what Mark is doing when he introduces these three women into the story of his Gospel and why they respond in such a way. And what I hope that I'll be able to show you, or what we will be able to think about, is that these women are not failures. They are rather faithful disciples. These women are not failures, they are faithful disciples. Like Simon's mother-in-law in Mark 1, and the bleeding woman in Mark 5, and the Syrophoenician woman in Mark 7, and the woman who gives all she has in Mark 12. Can we see a pattern developing? And the woman who anoints Jesus in Mark 14. These three women in Mark are faithful disciples of Jesus who speak the message of the gospel. These three women in Mark 16 are faithful disciples of Jesus who speak the message of the gospel. I have three daughters, Abigail, who is 5, Chloe, who turns 4 next week, and Rebecca, who's 16 months old. Perhaps if I had known that I was going to do this talk, we would have named them Mary, Mary, and Salome. But illustrations don't always work out precisely the way you want them to. If you have young children or grandchildren, or perhaps serve in the children's ministry at your church, or are simply aware that there are human beings alive who are younger than 10 years old, you will likely know that the word frozen no longer means what it used to mean. The Oxford English Dictionary helpfully tells us that the word frozen is an adjective that pertains to water and the process by which it becomes ice because of extreme cold. Or it could perhaps refer to food and the process by which it's prevented from decaying using extremely cold temperatures. That's the Oxford English Dictionary. In the Jeff Aernie's Daughter's English Dictionary, the word frozen means the fantastical tale of two sisters on parallel journeys of self-discovery and the quest to understand the profound relational implications of true love. Okay, they're 5, 4, and 16 months, so that's probably a bit of an overstatement. What it really means is the story of two sisters with really great music attached to it. What does frozen have to do with Mark's gospel? That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked. The connection is characters. There may be some here who haven't seen Frozen, so let me spoil bits of it for you. In the opening scene of the movie, we're introduced not to the two sisters around whom the film revolves, but to a small boy and his pet reindeer. You see that in Disney movies you can have reindeer pets, not dogs. It's nice. The introduction of this boy and his pet reindeer are what we call foreshadowing. The boy and his reindeer will later become key players in the story and part of the climactic resolution of the film, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. The boy, Christoph, is introduced into the film for a particular set of reasons. He represents a certain segment of the story. He's not the main character of the movie, but he's essential for the way in which the plot moves along, the way in which the movie moves towards its climactic moments. When we come to Mark's gospel, these women function much like Christoph. They're not the main characters, but they are essential to the movement and development of Mark's story. When we read the names of these women in Mark 16:1, it's important for us to know that this is not the first time we've been introduced to them. We're actually introduced to the women a few verses earlier. I imagine it's on the same page, so you can just scan up to Mark 15:40 to 41. During Jesus' crucifixion, we read, this is 15:40 and 41, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and served him. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And then again in Mark 15:47, when Jesus is being buried by Joseph of Arimathea, we read that Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. So in a matter of a few short verses, these women are thrust onto the scene of Mark's gospel. But what's really interesting, I think, is that Mark tells us in 15:40 to 41 that these women had been with Jesus from the time that he was in Galilee, from the time that he started his ministry. You remember from yesterday in Mark 7 that Jesus leaves Galilee and goes to Tyre. So he's in Galilee at the very beginning. They've been there the whole time, and yet Mark introduces them just now, at the end of the gospel. To stick with the imagery of a movie, these women had been off screen for the whole story, but now Mark has brought them on screen. Why? Why bring someone on screen at the very end of the gospel? Well, one answer to that question might be that Mark had a bit of a numbers problem. Mark recently had a significant number of his characters run off screen unexpectedly. I am, of course, referring to Jesus' disciples. the men who are supposed to remain with Jesus throughout the crucial events of the story have hit the proverbial eject button. During Jesus' arrest in the garden, we read in Mark 14, 50-52, that everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garments behind. Even Peter, the rock, who follows Jesus from a distance for a little while longer, is eventually brought down under the bright lights of the interrogation of a servant girl in the courtyard. And he leaves the story broken and weeping. That is a crucial part in Mark's gospel. At that moment, it looks like there's no one left to follow Jesus. And then all of a sudden, these women emerge into the climax of Mark's gospel. They enter the narrative just in time to see its key events: Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. That part of the gospel to which Mark has been building from the very beginning. It's a famous line in New Testament studies that Mark's gospel is just a passion narrative with a short introduction. And that Mark's gospel has been building to these key events. This is the climax of the story. These women don't just get put into the gospel to fill up space on the screen. In fact, they serve some more essential roles. Two very essential roles, I think. First, they show us what discipleship looks like. Look again with me, William, at Mark 15:41. 15:41. It says these women were following Jesus and serving Jesus. Perhaps it might say caring for his needs, but the word there is serving. And that's important to see that they were following and serving, because for Mark, those are key discipleship terms. When we read that these women were following Jesus, our minds are supposed to run right to what Jesus says in Mark 8:34. Whoever wants to be my disciples must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. These women have been living out that following. They are followers. And when we read that these women were serving Jesus, our minds should run right to what Jesus says in Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. These women have been living out that service. They're servers. When we're introduced to these women, they're not just people filling up space on the screen. They are disciples. When Mark introduces them at this key point of the gospel, he's making a clear contrast between the men who have been following Jesus but have fled, and these women who remain. Mark puts them on screen at this late stage in the gospel to help heighten that contrast. He's kept them off screen so that when they come on, we can see the difference. Wow, those disciples have fled and now the women remain. Okay? These women are positive characters. They're faithful disciples. That's the first role. The second role that these women play in the narrative is that of witnesses. Look at some of the key language in these verses associated with the idea of seeing. In Mark 15:40, they were watching during Jesus' crucifixion. Mark 15:47, they saw where he was laid. Mark 16:4, when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. Witnesses are important parts of stories, aren't they? The news for the last few days, of course, has been inundated with news about the verdict of the Oscar Pistorius trial. Okay? And one of the key realities of that trial is there are no witnesses except for Pistorius himself, and so the situation becomes convoluted because no one else can attest to what has happened. Okay? For Mark's story, he needs witnesses to be able to tell about these climactic events. And that's exactly what he sets these women up to do. When they come into the story, they serve as witnesses to these climactic events. They see Jesus die. They see where he is buried. They see that his body is not there. Okay? These women are there to demonstrate the reality of these events. They see what's going on. These women are the only people in the gospel who follow Jesus at these most crucial points, these most crucial moments. Throughout the gospel, Mark shows us that it's only when Jesus takes up the cross that we can understand who he is. If you've read through Mark's gospel before, and I hope you have because it's short, okay? You'll know that there's a somewhat odd idea that comes up time and time again throughout the gospel. And that odd idea is that Jesus often tells other people not to say anything about him. He accomplishes a miracle and then he demands silence. It's a very strange part of Mark's story, Jesus preventing his identity from getting out. The reason I think for that secret is that it's not until we come to Jesus' passion narrative, to Jesus' cross and resurrection, that we're truly able to know who he is. And the only people who are there for all of those events in Mark's gospel, the only people who are in a position to understand the brutality of the cross, the reality of Jesus' death, and the wonder of the resurrection, are Mary, and Salome. These women are the followers of Jesus who remain with him throughout these events. So why Mark? Okay, Mark did not help us out. Okay, why did they flee from the tomb in fear and silence? Mark 16:8, we read, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Even if I could convince you that these women are the key disciples in Mark's story, this verse doesn't sound too good for them. At this point of the gospel, many who read Mark think that Mark is setting a little trap for us. We're expecting the women to be positive characters, but they end up fleeing, just like the disciples in the garden and Peter at the trial. And many will argue that the purpose of that narrative trap is audience participation. As readers of the gospel, we're meant to hear about the women's silence. Then we see the screen fade to black, and we have a question to answer. Fail or follow? Speech or silence? What will we do as disciples in response to what the women have done? That would be an extremely powerful literary technique, but as far as we can tell, no one in the ancient world writes a story like that. No one in the ancient world writes a conclusion that they know to be false so that the reader can supply some different information. The real problem with that reading, of course, is that we know that someone must have said something, or else we wouldn't be reading Mark 16:8. Is there another way forward then? I think so. Keep a hand in Mark 16 and turn all the way back to Mark 1. All the way back to Mark 1. Mark's gospel is very fast-paced. Mark's favorite word is immediately. I know the microphone's here, so I won't run around. When I teach Mark's gospel to my students, I often spend most of the lecture running around the room so they get a sense of just how fast-paced the gospel really is. You have to make sure you've gone to the gym before you get to that lecture, so you have the lung capacity to do it. Mark's gospel is very fast-paced, and in the early part of the story, we get a series of very brief vignettes about Jesus' activity. So he arrives on the scene, he's baptized, he's tempted in the wilderness, he calls disciples, he exorcises a demon, he heals Simon's mother-in-law. I didn't go to the gym this morning. He heals some other people in Capernaum. He prays. And then, look at Mark 1:40 to 45. In Mark 1:40 to 45, we read about a time when Jesus heals a man with leprosy. Very interestingly, after Jesus heals the man, what does he say to him? See that you don't tell this to anyone. The language there, that's Mark 1:44. See that you don't tell this to anyone. The language there in Mark 1:44 is a very close parallel to what we read in Mark 16:8. The healed man is supposed to say nothing. The women say nothing. It's the same type of language. That's not the end of the story in Mark 1. Keep reading in Mark 1:44. That's not the only thing Jesus says. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Jesus gives the man a very specific command. He restricts his speech to a particular individual, the priest. Likewise, the young man at the tomb restricts the women's speech. The message that the women receive about Jesus' resurrection is specifically for the disciples and Peter. With my own fear and trembling then, I want to suggest that we need to translate Mark 16:8 just a little bit differently. It's not that the women said nothing to anyone, but that the women said nothing to anyone else. They receive the message from the young man, and they go immediately to relay it to the disciples and Peter. They do not fail to tell anyone. They succeed in delivering the message which they were given. When the disciples flee from the garden, they're leaving Jesus behind. When the women flee from the tomb, they're going to fulfill Jesus' word. Okay? There was nothing left for them at the tomb. They weren't supposed to stick around and have morning tea. Okay? Discipleship for them meant fleeing away from the tomb. Jesus was gone, so go to Jesus. They take the message of restoration and renewal back to the disciples so that Mark can highlight the reality and power of the resurrection. This dramatic conclusion of Mark's gospel does in fact aim for audience participation, but the emphasis isn't on overturning the women's failure, but on participating in the same story for which they are witnesses. In the climactic scenes of Frozen, the protagonist Anna has a crucial choice to make. Will she seek to save herself by seeking the redemptive power of Kristoff's true love's kiss, or will she come to the rescue of her sister in a position of mortal danger? The women in Mark have a similar decision to make. They can join the disciples, saving themselves, fleeing from the climactic moments of Jesus' life, or they can remain. They can remain as faithful followers of Jesus who speak. You see, these women are speaking disciples. They speak in two ways. First, they speak to the disciples, relaying to them the message of Jesus' resurrection. But second, and more importantly, they speak with their lives. They remain with Jesus even when no one else is willing to remain. Within this story, the women speak the gospel with their actions. They speak by following. They speak by serving. They speak by persisting faithfully to the end of the story, even after Jesus has seemingly died. They speak the message of restoration and renewal that Jesus brings. They become the first bearers of God's most dramatic act of recreation, the resurrection of Jesus. The conclusion of Mark's gospel aims for audience participation. It's a call to participate in this same story for which these women are the key witnesses. The implied question with which Mark ends his gospel is whether we are willing to go and do likewise. In the midst of our own context, are we willing to be identified with the cross? Are we willing to carry the message of the resurrection out into the world? To be a speaking disciple in a world marked by immorality and hostility means relearning the shape of discipleship that these women show us. Pick up the cross, carry Jesus' death with you, and speak the remarkable news of the resurrection with both your mouths and your lives. Let's pray.